Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm in Paddington today. I've used the station hundreds of times, but I have to admit the surrounding area is not the part of London I'm hugely familiar with. I've been to one or two of the pubs that we're going to visit on today's video before, but the rest are new to me too, so this is going to be as much a voyage of discovery for me as it may or may not be for you. Cheers from the Royal Exchange. This is possibly not as noteworthy or well regarded as some of the other pubs on today's list, but I thought it would make an interesting starting point because it says a little bit about the history of the Paddington area. And I have a bit of a soft spot for glazed, tiled exterior pubs. The name Royal Exchange doesn't refer to the neoclassical centre of commerce in the City of London as you might expect it to, but apparently is a reference to a time when mail was still delivered by coach and horses, and at some point over long journeys the coaches and or horses had to be swapped because it was too much for the horses or too much for the coachmen to continue any further. And that sort of somewhat ties in with the history of the area. The pub dates back to 1832, which is roughly contemporary with the introduction of the GWR, the Great Western Railway, and it has its terminus here, of course, at Paddington. So I suppose the name Royal Exchange recalls an earlier era prior to the coming of steam trains to Paddington. The signpost for the pub, however, which is a little bit hard to see now, it's nicely faded with time, has a sort of slightly whimsical interpretation of Royal Exchange and appears to be referencing Shakespeare's Richard III, My Kingdom for a Horse. The interior still has some nice traditional elements to it. It's got a pleasant sort of wooden bar with a kind of colonnaded gantry above it, and there's an illuminated sign with the name of the pub on the bar back. The seatings, sort of nice wooden stools and some wooden bench seating in almost a snug towards the back of the main bar room. The big TV screens showing sports, not my personal cup of tea, but I'm a grumbly old man who doesn't like sports, so what can I say? But it's certainly quite a pleasant boozer inside, I would say, minus the TV screens maybe. Until recently, I believe this pub was exclusively keg beer, but on this visit today, where are we, October 2023, they do have two beers on hand pumps. There was some kind of IPA that I just ignored, and Doom Bar, which I'm just having a half of now, came in at £3 for a half. The building, or the short terrace that the pub is now on, is listed, I think, grade 2, and Historic England cites it as being early 19th century, which ties in with the establishment date cited elsewhere of 1832. Although the frontage that I'm quite fond of, these glazed tiles, are probably 20th century, a later addition. Paddington, the area of London, probably has Saxon origins, and it is speculated that the name derives from a Anglo-Saxon chieftain, Padder. It's always been a transport hub throughout its history. We know it now because of the station, of course, the Bear. But in its earliest incarnation, it was at the crossroads of two Roman roads. Watling Street, which runs along Edgware Road, and if you've ever wondered why Edgware Road by London standards is amazingly long and straight, that is because it follows the course of an old Roman road. Next up, the Monkey Puzzle. As you can probably tell from the exterior, this is absolutely a modern pub. I didn't originally include this on my list of pubs to visit in the Paddington area, but I've just passed it and I think I am going to pop in for two reasons, which I will explain momentarily. Cheers from the Monkey Puzzle. As I said, two reasons for making a quick detour to come in here. The first being I have a bit of a soft spot for Badger Brewery. This is Thirsty Ferret. They had two different Badger beers on their hand pumps. The other was Tanglefoot. I've already forgotten the price of this. Was it something like £2.60? It seemed fairly reasonable. I think £2.60 maybe for a half. So that's the first reason for coming here. The second is that this is my friend Andy, who you may remember I mentioned in some of my previous videos. Sadly has gone missing, moved to China years ago and never heard from him since. This was the first pub he ever came to in London when he first moved here. He grew up in a sort of country town where everybody knew each other. And Andy would tell me when he first came to London, he would say hello to people in the streets because that was normal back home, and he got a lot of strange looks, as you can imagine. I have a bit of a soft spot for this pub for that reason, because it reminds me of my good friend Andy. So yeah, wherever you are, Andy, cheers to you. It is undeniably a modern pub, I believe, according to What Pub, built in 1969, and it appears that the pub takes its name after the monkey puzzle tree, which you can hopefully see beside me, and off to the other side you can possibly see a bit of the relatively high rise for the era, late 60s development. I assume it's a block of flats that the pub forms part of. I think they have made a bit of an effort on the interior to make it sort of cozy and pubby. There's some nice stained glass partitions and some interesting prints and pictures hanging up on the wall, including possibly my favourite, a very large reproduction of William Morgan's 1682 map of London, something that I've been referring to quite a lot recently in some of my sort of historic pub research. So you know, if you can get past the perhaps not very eye-catching building that it's housed in, and if you happen to be a fan of Badger beer, I think this pub actually has something going for it, despite being, you know, undeniably modern. This corner of the area of London we now know as Paddington, or which has always been called Paddington, this particular neighbourhood is called Tyburnia. I've somehow never heard that name before, which is interesting. It apparently dates to the 1820s and was the first sort of modern era development of Paddington, laid out in the 1820s by Samuel Pepys Cockerell, and as the name suggests, he is indeed an ancestor of Samuel Pepys, I believe his great nephew. I think a lot of the buildings we're looking at right now are much more modern than that, but as we go a little bit further down we'll see some probably of the original 1820s stucco fronted buildings. Some of those grander 1820s, presumably, walking in the middle of the road, terraces here. It was built as a direct northwestern London competitor to Belgravia, and the name is very much a riff on Belgravia, taking in as well the Tyburn Cross, which was roughly at the site of what we now know as Marble Arch. Okay, next up, and I'm standing in the middle of the road again now, the Victoria, probably the most well-known pub on today's itinerary. Cheers from the Victoria. There is a lot to say, or a lot has been written about this pub, so we have quite a lot to get through here. Sorry as always for the background noise from the cars. It dates to roughly 1840, so it's somewhat contemporary with the development of this area called Tyburnia. Some sources date it as, to 1837, some sort of slightly later into the 1840s. On the ground floor, at least, possibly the most notable feature is the bar back. There's a clock sort of integrated with that piece of joinery that has a date of 1864, and that may tell you the date of the rest of the installation of the bar back. And according to CAMRA, that may make it one of the 3 oldest bar backs known about in the country. The brass tap water dispenser on the bar, originally made for sort of topping up whiskies and other spirits that needed a dash of water in them, is quite possibly contemporary with the rest of the bar back, quite possibly 1860s. So that's an ancient fitting, really, by pub standards. Amazingly still working. Delighted to see a quick demonstration there from the lady behind the bar, very kindly showing me that it does in fact still dispense water. She was a bit skeptical whether or not it would still be of sort of drinking quality. I'm sure people still do drink their water, it's still flowing. There are 2 further rooms upstairs at the pub, the theatre bar and the library bar, or the theatre room, the library room. The theatre bar probably the most interesting of the 2. It has very ornate fittings that were salvaged from the Gaiety Theatre in the late 1950s. It looks very, as you might expect, sort of theatrical and grand. And then the other side of the upstairs, there is the library bar, which I assume is a much more recent interior. It's sort of a, you know, somewhat synthetic, pretend version of a library. It's a Fuller's pub today, so I always say this don't have the usual lineup of Fuller's beers. It isn't. Had a couple of slightly different guest beers on tap. I've just went for boring, good old, reliable London Pride. I forget the price, perhaps I'll put it on the screen if I remember. I think the food here is quite well regarded. It seems to be very popular with diners. Those two upstairs rooms are really just reserved for diners. In fact, I think you need a reservation for those two upstairs rooms. The ground floor is still gratifyingly a free-for-all, as pubs should be. Perhaps you can put reserved tables, I don't know. But you know, certainly it's still possible to come here just for a drink. So yes, it's a really opulent interior. It's a real sort of visual feast. And this is the only pub that I knew well from this area prior to coming here again today. I'd been several times before, and you know, if I were to just direct anyone to one pub in the Paddington area, I'm fairly sure it would be this one. Next up, the Swan. Cheers from the Swan. Another Fuller's pub. This is it's a listed building, and it has a Wikipedia page about it, which sort of gives it some noteworthiness, I suppose, but it isn't on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors. Yeah, I think the interior was slightly better than I had anticipated. There is a bit of the horrible Farrow ball paint all over the place, but there are some, you know, some points of slight interest. The prints and artifacts hanging from the walls have this kind of avian theme. There is what I assume to be a collection of swan feathers, possibly the white feathers on one wall, and on another wall a collection of butterflies. I think the frontage of this pub is actually quite attractive. It has this, you can probably see it behind me now, it has this overhanging canopy that I suppose worked originally as a balcony for the first floor. I'm not sure if that's accessible now. There is an upper room, but it's used for sort of private functions. And there's these possibly cast iron pillars holding it up with lamps running along the length of that canopy there. Possibly would have at one time been gas lamps, but obviously very much electric now. Possibly a coaching inn originally, and may date back to 1721. This is one of those pubs that was supposedly used as a sort of stopping off point for prisoners being taken from prison to Tyburn to be hanged, and this was where they were given their last drink. And one particular notable prisoner who was having a final drink here at the Swan was apparently Claude Duval, the gentleman highwayman. Claude Duval was possibly single-handedly responsible for this myth, this sort of romanticized version of the highwayman. He was very anti-violence, and the worst he ever did to his victims of his crimes was to tie them to trees. Apparently never actually shot anybody or exacted violence on the victims of his robberies. But you know, still, we're talking about the 17th century, when you could possibly be sentenced to death for stealing a loaf of bread. It was a period of rather harsh justice. So despite becoming quite a popular figure, despite being a professional criminal, he was ultimately hung at Tyburn in 1680, I think it was. No, 1670. And this, the Swan Inn, was apparently his last port of call for one final drink. One wonders what he ordered. As a Frenchman, probably not London Pride, I'm imagining today another Fuller's pub. This is Autumn Fox, their autumn beer, I forget, Red Fox Autumn beer, whatever it's called. I forget the price as well, but I'll put that on the screen. That comes in for a half. Quite a nice location, the Swan. It faces onto Hyde Park. I'm going to do some terrible camera work now to illustrate that and turn you around. See the fence of Hyde Park here, beyond that greenery, so forth. Next, and possibly the final pub of today's tour, the Mitre. Cheers from the Mitre. Not to be confused with the old Mitre. There are several pubs called this. In this particular instance, this is a corner pub, and it is believed that possibly one reason that it is named as it is that this sort of the wedge shape of the building looks a bit like a mitre, a bishop's hat. Could be. I suspect it may be something to do with this area of London. Tyburnia was originally land owned by the Bishop of London, so it may be some reference to, you know, the original owner of the land, as pub names often are. Tip of the hat to the local squire, or tip of the mitre in this case to the local squire. There's a local spire over there as well. If I can figure out what church that is, I'll put it on the bottom of the screen. CAMRA, on their list of historic pub interiors, rate this a 2-star. I forgot to mention earlier, but the Victoria back there was a 3-star, but I can see at least some people preferring the interior here, not least because I'm hitting it at a slightly quieter time and you can enjoy it with a bit more sort of tranquility. But there is a lot to see on the interior here. One of my favourite parts is this passage off to one side of the pub that has a number of doorways. So it's inside the pub, but it then has doorways onto the separate bar areas that would have at one time been within the pub. Like all modern pubs, it's been opened out into one large bar space, but in the Victorian era this would have been lots of separate, wonderfully pokey compartments. And there is, including a ladies only bar, a saloon bar, a private bar. Was there a public bar? I forget. And that passageway in itself, just the corridor going into the other bits of the pub, is quite a joy to behold, with mosaic tiled flooring, glazed tiles on the wall on one side, and this huge array of differently glazed panels on all these doors leading into these different bar areas. I think this is a pub that's all about its doors. I think they seem to be the most notable and most striking features, including the main, what seems to be the main entrance door. So we're at the kind of the apex, if that's the right word, of this corner pub here. And sorry about the terrible camera work. This kind of double set of doors here, really quite impressive, with this 3 bars of, is that brass, and more etching here. The name of the pub there, Mitre. So these outer doors are curved, the inner door more of a straight door, but quite an impressive effect somehow. These windows and the exterior also of some note. CAMRA describes them as Gothic style tracery. Quite sure, but this is certainly quite a, for this period, Victorian pub of the sort of mid 19th century. That's a bit of an unusual feature. I don't know if it comes out on camera, but those panes of glass in the frontmost windows are in fact curved as well, so that must be a nightmarish thing to replace. Well, I feel I haven't really entirely done the Mitre here justice in terms of the blurb. There is a lot written about this pub. I always try and put links to what pub and CAMRA's historic pub interiors website down in the description down there, so if you'd like to read more about this pub, I suggest to go take a look at some of those links. I think I'm going to call it a day there. Just a handful of pubs in the Paddington area. You'll notice I've stayed south of Paddington, not venturing north to, for example, sort of Maida Vale, that area. I'll probably make a separate video about that at some point. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I hope some of that was interesting or useful. Hope you have some suggestions for where to go if you ever find yourself thirsty in the Paddington area. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.